Good morning and afternoon, everyone. My name's Christina McHale, and thank you for participating in today's 1721st Justice Clearinghouse webinar. During today's webinar, we'll be talking about turning NIBIN into action. NIBIN, or the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, has evolved beyond a forensic tool into a powerful resource for investigations and violence reduction. When used intentionally, it can support both day-to-day casework and broader crime reduction strategies. So during today's webinar, we'll talk about the Crime Gun Intelligence Center, or CGIC model, and how agencies are using NIBIN in real-world settings like Detroit and Chattanooga to generate leads, improve coordination, and support focused gun crime reduction efforts. Our speakers today are Dr. Rick Derenfeld and Dr. Elena DeBasi. Dr. Rick Derenfeld is a professor and department head of criminal justice at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga and the director of the UTC Violence Reduction Initiative, where he partners with agencies like Chattanooga Police Department to support violence reduction efforts. He also brings over a decade of experience as a police officer and criminal investigator. Dr. Elena DiBiase is an assistant professor at Wayne State University who works with law enforcement agencies to design and evaluate violence prevention strategies with a focus on crime gun intelligence. She has been closely involved with the Detroit Crime Gun Intelligence Center and continues to support CGIC efforts through federal initiatives. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our friends and partners for helping with today's webinar. Today's webinar is done in partnership with Leads Online. We truly appreciate working with organizations like Leads Online who are so committed to enhancing and growing the profession. And now, briefly before we begin, I'd like to share with you some information about the Justice Clearinghouse. The Justice Clearinghouse is the only peer-to-peer educational program for justice professionals that emphasizes the multidisciplinary nature of an effective justice system. Through our various online trainings, our audience and subscribers begin to develop a comprehensive understanding of the justice system while breaking down its many misconceptions. Our paid members have unlimited access to over 1,700 hours of recorded webinars, are eligible to receive certificates of attendance, and can register for all of our upcoming live webinars. And the last thing I wanted to address with everybody are some basic housekeeping items. First, this event is being recorded and the formal presentation is scheduled to last about 60 minutes and will be available to subscribers on the Justice Clearinghouse website. Second, this is a listen-only event, but you can type as many questions as you have in the Zoom questions box area. We'll take as many of your questions as possible at the end of the webinar. Now, given the remote nature of webinars, our speakers can't read your body language or see your facial expressions, so do feel free to use the emojis in the React area on the Zoom toolbar just to let the speakers know how you're feeling about the information they're sharing. And one last thing here before we get started, I did want to remind everybody that after today's webinar, there will be a follow-up survey, and we do ask that you complete it. Your feedback is shared with our presenters and helps us shape everything we do here at Justice Clearinghouse. And so with that, let's turn our presentation over to our instructors for the day. Welcome back, everybody. Rick, Elena, it's all yours.
Thank you for the introduction. As mentioned, I'm Elena DiBiase. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Wayne State University. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Rick Derenfeld, a professor in the Department of Criminal Justice at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. And you'll be hearing from us both today as we highlight the Detroit and Chattanooga Crime Gun Intelligence Centers. Now, from this point forward, I'm going to turn my camera off because I'm having a little bit of some Wi-Fi connectivity issues, and I'll put my camera back on at the end of the presentation. Across the country, agencies are working to respond to and prevent shootings in their communities. And many of these incidents, one of the most important pieces of evidence left behind are cartridge cases. Historically, those cartridge cases were treated as evidence tied to a single shooting event. But with the development of the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, or NIBIN, we now know that they can tell a much larger story. NIBIN can link shootings across time and space, and in doing so, generate investigative leads, help identify patterns of violence, and more broadly, advance understanding on how gun violence is unfolding within and across jurisdictions. The challenge, however, is not just generating those connections, it's turning that information into something useful, something investigators can act on, and something agencies can use strategically to guide their violence reduction efforts. And that's where Crime Gun Intelligence Centers come into play, or CGICs. CGICs represent cross-sector partnerships that enable the rapid collection, analysis, and dissemination of ballistic intelligence, with the ultimate goal of incapacitating violent gun offenders. Today's presentation highlights the capacity of NIBIN and the CGIC model to translate ballistic connections into real-world impact, both tactically and strategically, by generating actionable intelligence that supports investigations and informs responses to gun violence. So to that end, our presentation is motivated by 5 overarching goals. Broadly, we aim to increase awareness of the value of NIBIN and how it can be used most effectively to support shooting investigations and broader strategic efforts to address firearm violence. We also highlight the role that CGICs play in operationalizing this work and provide case studies from Detroit and Chattanooga, 2 contextually different sites, to illustrate how they are using NIBIN to support investigations and inform strategic responses to shootings. And finally, we offer a few practical considerations for agencies that are looking to strengthen their use of NIBIN and CGIC-related practices. So to advance these goals, we'll start with a brief overview of NIBIN, its tactical and strategic potential, some early research assessing its impact, and the core standards that guide how it should be implemented. Rick will then introduce the CGIC model and its role in combating gun violence. And then from there, we'll move into the core of the presentation, which includes case studies from the field. Rick will highlight the work being done in the Chattanooga CGIC, and I'll showcase work in the Detroit CGIC. And finally, we'll conclude with a few key takeaways and highlight some practical considerations for agencies looking to strengthen their use of NIBIN and CGIC-related practices. So let's begin with a brief level set on NIBIN. The National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, or NIBIN, is the system and process used to collect, analyze, and share intelligence gained from ballistic evidence. Here's how it works in a nutshell. Most firearms eject cartridge cases when fired, leaving unique fingerprints in the form of microscopic markings. These cartridge cases can be collected at crime scenes or from test fires of recovered firearms. Using a NIBIN acquisition station or brass tracks machine, high-resolution 3D digital images of these cartridge cases are captured, along with information from the criminal incident itself. These images are then cross-correlated against existing entries in NIBIN to identify potential matches. When the system finds high-confidence correlations, these are reviewed and confirmed by a trained NIBIN technician. Once confirmed, they become NIBIN leads. A NIBIN lead connects 2 or more pieces of ballistic evidence from separate incidents, indicating that the same firearm was likely used in each event. These leads are powerful. They allow agencies to connect shootings that might otherwise look unrelated, helping investigators identify shooters, disrupt cycles of violence, and focus investigative resources where they matter most. Now, to become a NIBIN hit, the connecting cartridge cases must be examined by a certified firearm examiner, and only then can they be used as evidence in court. Now, while NIBIN is a powerful tool, it's important to understand that not all firearms are eligible for entry into NIBIN. What doesn't get entered? Pieces of ballistic evidence from firearms that are typically not entered into NIBIN include revolvers, single-shot or bolt-action rifles, shotguns and gauges other than 12 gauge, weapons that have never been fired, and firearms deemed unsafe, inoperable, or incomplete. The majority of what gets entered into NIBIN are 9mm pistols, and that reflects the reality of the types of firearms most often used in crime. Now that we covered what NIBIN is, let's talk about why it matters, specifically the tactical and strategic benefits it offers for gun violence reduction. At the tactical level, NIBIN helps investigators connect shootings more quickly. By linking cartridge cases and test fire evidence recovered across crime scenes, NIBIN can show that the same firearm was likely used across multiple incidents, even when those incidents occur in different neighborhoods or at different times. In doing so, it expands the pool of potential witnesses, suspects, and evidence by connecting incidents that might not have seemed related at first, allowing investigators to piece together a broader narrative of what's happening on the ground. This can build stronger cases and in doing so improve clearance rates and help identify shooters who might otherwise fly under the radar. Now, on the strategic front, the growing repository of ballistic evidence within NIBIN offers a uniquely valuable source of information on shootings, enhancing broader understanding of gun violence while also guiding proactive enforcement initiatives aimed toward disrupting the violence. So while NIBIN has the potential to support both investigations and broader violence reduction strategies, agencies often use the system in very different ways depending on the resources and workflows. So before we go further, we'd like to get a sense of how NIBIN is being used in your agency, and you should see a poll question pop up on your screen. So please take some time to complete that.
Okay, folks, that polling question is open. Again, the question is, which statement best reflects your agency's current use of NIBIN? Is it primarily tactical, primarily strategic, both tactical and strategic, minimal or limited use, not sure, or my agency doesn't use NIBIN? We'll give everybody a few more seconds to get your votes in. I see we just about got half, but I'd like to get a little bit more in terms of response before we close things out. Okay, let's go ahead and close the polling and share the results. Okay, Elena, 15% of the audience said primarily tactical, 9% said primarily strategic, 44% said both tactical and strategic, 8% said minimal or limited use, 12% weren't sure, and another 12% said that their agency does not use NIBIN. Was that what you were expecting in terms of results?
I think this is really interesting. I'm happy to hear that, the dominant category here is both tactical and strategic. Thank you for your responses. I'm going to close this out and we can move forward. Okay, so before the era of the CGIC, while the potential of NIBIN was widely recognized, early research more than a decade ago often showed that the system, unfortunately, did not fully deliver on that promise. And one of the primary challenges was time. Delays in the processing of NIBIN acquisitions, and particularly in the generation of NIBIN leads, often meant that investigative momentum had already slowed by the time a NIBIN lead was identified. And even when leads were generated, the information contained within those early reports, often called NIBIN lead packets, often lacked the context investigators needed to take meaningful action. What the early research did, among other things, was identify the bottlenecks that needed to be addressed for NIBIN to reach its full potential. And as you can imagine, a lot has changed since then. CGICs and notably ATF have helped rectify these earlier shortcomings, and we'll talk later about how they have helped bring us much closer to optimizing NIBIN as a tool that can support both investigations and broader strategic responses to gun violence. Before turning to the CGIC model, it's important to highlight a few critical standards that are fundamental to ensuring NIBIN functions as an effective investigative and strategic tool. So to fully realize NIBIN's tactical and strategic potential, agencies need to collect and submit all eligible pieces of evidence into NIBIN. This is absolutely critical and an extremely foundational step on which literally all other aspects of NIBIN are built. And here is why it matters. Tactically, comprehensive collection ensures that investigators have all the information on hand to link suspects across cases and remove shooters from the community before further violence occurs. Strategically, it builds a more complete map of gun violence patterns within and across jurisdictions, informing focused prevention and enforcement efforts. Without comprehensive collection, gaps appear in the network, making it harder to link shootings and identify the people driving violence in a community. So I want to walk through an example. In this example, let's consider 3 recorded shooting events. Incident 1 occurring on August 4th, 2025, Incident 2 occurring November 11th, 2025, and Incident 3 occurring March 3rd, 2026. Now, if comprehensive collection is in place, cartridge cases from all 3 crime scenes are collected and entered into NIBIN. And because of that, we get back a NIBIN lead showing that these incidents are indeed connected. With that lead in hand, investigators can start asking really critical questions. These incidents are close together. What's that about? What types of offenses were involved? How far apart in time do these incidents occur? Days, weeks? Is this emerging as a hotspot? And should we consider deploying more patrols or outreach teams in this area? Could this be a prolific firearm being used by a group or individual driving local violence? And does it need prioritized attention? So in other words, this NIBIN lead can trigger a string of investigative actions and proactive decisions that help prevent future violence. Now let's look at what happens when comprehensive collection doesn't happen. So in this scenario, we have the same three shooting incidents involving the same firearm, but only ballistic evidence from incident one is collected and entered into NIBIN. And this is the first time this firearms evidence is in the system. No evidence from incident two or incident three is entered into NIBIN, and because of that, we get no lead connecting these incidents. From the system's perspective, incident two and three are invisible, and incident one appears unrelated to anything else. And that just really is a huge missed opportunity. Without comprehensive collection, we might assume these shootings are isolated incidents instead of connected events. And we miss the chance to link cases, identify suspects, or understand patterns. We lose the opportunity to recognize a potentially prolific firearm being used in the community. We are unable to ask and act on the operational questions we discussed before. Now, let me give you like a really quick on the ground real world example from Detroit that really drives this point home. So here's one of our NIBIN success stories. So imagine an officer responded to a non-fatal shooting and there were no suspects at the scene and witnesses were unwilling to cooperate. So from a traditional investigative standpoint, this case had really very little to go on. But officers recovered 9mm cartridge cases and those were entered into NIBIN, and that's where things started to change. The ballistic evidence linked to this incident to four additional non-fatal shootings and a shots fired incident. During investigations of this incident, an individual was arrested for carrying a firearm without a permit. And that firearm was taken, test fired, and entered into NIBIN. And that person was then eventually arrested for the CCW violation and is now a suspect and person of interest because the NIBIN hit came back connecting that firearm to the previous non-fatal shootings. So this is just one example of how NIBIN could be really used to great success. And it's unlikely that the CCW arrest alone would have been connected to these three incidents had it not been from the prior evidence already being entered into NIBIN. So now let's scale this up. When comprehensive collection doesn't happen, it's not just local connections we miss. At the state level, failing to enter ballistic evidence means we can miss intrastate patterns, patterns happening within states. A firearm used in one city might later be used in another, but if evidence isn't entered consistently across jurisdictions, we lose the chance to see that connection. We might also miss identifying a shooter moving between cities or a gang conflict spilling across municipal lines. Now, at the national level, gaps in collection mean our ability to identify interstate patterns is also compromised, so patterns happening across states. For example, a gun recovered in your state could have been used in a shooting in another state, but without NIBIN entries on both ends, that connection is invisible. Patterns of the same firearm showing up across states could help ATF and local agencies trace illegal gun flows, identify traffickers, and disrupt supply chains feeding violence in our communities. Now, really to further illustrate this point, the figure shown here comes from Volume 2 of the ATF's National Firearms Commerce and Trafficking Assessment, which is a national study examining firearm commerce, trafficking patterns, and crime gun intelligence across the United States. So it shows the number of cartridge cases and test fire acquisitions entered into NIBIN from 2017 to 2021, and you can see an upward trend each year. Now here we're looking at the same period of time, but reported here are the number of NIBIN leads for test fires and cartridge case evidence. Ultimately, as NIBIN acquisitions increased, NIBIN leads rose in step. So the bottom line here is the more you put in, the more leads you get out, fueling investigations and violence prevention efforts. So before moving forward into the introduction of crime gun intelligence centers, which Rick is leading, let's pause here for another poll question.
Okay, folks, where does your agency currently experience bottlenecks in the NIBIN process? Is it the cartridge case collection at the scene? Is it test fires of recovered crime guns, timely submission to the lab, ballistic evidence acquisition into NIBIN, correlation in lead generation, lead review, investigative follow-up, information sharing across units or agencies, or some other bottleneck or no major bottlenecks, or my agency doesn't use NIBIN? I know there's a lot of options there. We'll give you a few seconds to get your votes in. Okay, I'm starting to see things slow down here. I did want to give you guys enough time to get your votes in. I know that there's a lot of options there, but in the interest of time, I think I'm going to go ahead and close the polling and share the results. Okay, 3% of the audience said cartridge case collection at the scene. 13% said test fires of recovered crime guns. 29% said timely submission to the lab. 3% said ballistic evidence acquisition to NIBIN. 4% correlation and lead generation. 6% lead review. 21% investigative follow up. Another 21% information sharing across units or agencies. 3% other bottleneck, 19% said no major bottlenecks, and 16% said that their agency does not use NIBIN. So, what are your thoughts on those results?
I think this is really interesting. I am happy to see that so few had any issues with lead generation. My guess is that a lot of agencies might be hooked into the NNCTC and are able to get those leads back very quickly. Very interesting results. Okay, I'm going to move forward and I'm going to turn it over to Rick.
All right, we'll kick off with a discussion of CGIC. So, in an effort to overcome the issues Alana just described, and then several of those bottlenecks that were just covered in that poll question, the ATF sought to encourage agencies to adopt standardized best practices and really harness the utility of NIBIN and E-Trace through the launch of its CGIC initiative in 2016. Now, CGICs are designed to serve as hubs for intelligence and coordination between local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies as they respond to a broad range of firearm offenses. Now, in that vein, CGICs leverage the forensic utility of NIBIN and E-Trace, and they encourage interagency cooperation to support the investigation and prosecution of violent gun offenders. So CGIC sites are structured around five principles. First, consistently collect all ballistic evidence, utilize NIBIN and E-Trace in a timely manner, establish a dedicated investigative team to coordinate efforts, use forensic technology to derive investigations and prosecutions, and finally establish and maintain partnerships. The primary goal of CGICs is to increase the timeliness with which violent gun offenders are identified, arrested, and charged. Now, simultaneously, those centers are used to support law enforcement agencies in their efforts to identify the sources of crime guns, reduce the frequency of gun crime, and really build trust and confidence within the community. Now, each of those goals is more easily met if departments adhere to the CGIC workflow. Chris, we'll leave it to you.
You bet, not a problem. I wasn't sure if you were going to if you needed to tee things up, not a problem. Folks, what is a typical time frame from evidence acquisition to a NIBIN lead in your agency? Your options are less than 2 days, 3 to 6 days, 1 to 2 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks, more than a month, or you're not sure. And again, we'll give everybody a few seconds to think through those options. I see here some folks in the chat box area are saying at least a week. That's good to hear. That's good to know. Okay. Let's give you all another second or two to get your votes in. Okay, looks like we've got votes that are slowing down now. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and close the polling and share the results. Okay, so 23% said less than 2 days, 11% said 3 to 6 days, 16% said 1 to 2 weeks, 6% said 3 to 4 weeks, 5% said more than a month, and 39% said they weren't sure. Rick, is that typical in your experience?
I mean, overall, it's encouraging. If you given that same polling question even 5 years ago, I think you'd have seen the plurality in the 3 to 4 weeks to more than a month. And that indicates we're trending in the right direction.
Back to you.
All right, so the first step I mentioned in the CGIC workflow is comprehensive collection of cartridge cases and crime guns, right? And to that point, I really do need to stress the word comprehensive. Right? To ensure this is done effectively and truly maximize the utility of NIBIN and CGIC, that does require department policies that mirror ATF minimum required operating standards. Now, in particular, department policy has to mandate the collection and submission of ballistic evidence from crime guns. And the effectiveness of that policy, that can be bolstered by others that require things like canvassing of areas of the shots fired, because that's frequently going to lead to the identification of additional ballistic evidence and cooperative witnesses. Now, failure to do that really does risk making the rest of the CGIC workflow a futile enterprise. The second step is NIBIN entry and correlation and crime gun tracing. The key here, folks, is timeliness. If you want actionable intelligence, then you've got to aim for submission of spent cartridge casings and recovered crime guns within 24 hours of collection. And trace requests should really be made at the time of NIBIN submission. And in that vein, outsourcing the correlation review process to NNCTC has been a godsend for the roughly 36 NIBIN sites that partner with it. Because NNCTC, they really do a fantastic job of reducing the time between NIBIN acquisition and NIBIN lead notification. Now, for context, and I can speak for the agencies that I've worked with, that closed that window from months to days. The third step is ATF CGIC crime gun intelligence analysis. And this is the point at which CGICs really start to influence case outcomes. If they're functioning as they should, then they're able to package information from NIBIN with other relevant information. So we're talking about related investigative reports, information gleaned from cell phone analysis, gunshot detection systems, license plate readers, mobile camera systems, network analysis, and social media. I mean, those are the big ones. And CGICs take all of that raw information and they're able to use it to develop actionable leads. The fourth step is NIBIN lead and hit assignment investigation. Now, with the number of NIBIN leads and firearm traces increasing, we can quickly and easily hit a point of information overload. And then that's really where we start to inhibit our own investigations. And that's why it's important to really triage and focus on leads with the highest investigative potential. So in other words, we want to prioritize actionable intelligence by geography of shooting cycle, event type, time between linked events, and solvability. Now, following that process is going to highlight the need for the fifth step, which is criminal justice stakeholder collaboration. Regularly schedule collaborative meetings between CGIC investigators, prosecutors, your research partners, your other stakeholders. It's key. I can't overemphasize it. It can be really helpful in a sense to think of this as a comp stat model, because we're talking about rapid review of new intelligence and establishing both objectives and strategies for achieving those objectives. Now, it also means we must maintain a focus on data sharing so that all stakeholders can monitor, track, and analyze cases. That's the thing that keeps us nimble and adaptive to gun crime. It allows us to be a lot more effective in identifying and neutralizing our most prolific shooters and removing the most chronic crime guns from circulation. And in line with that perspective is the sixth step, and that is state and federal prosecution. We all know how we want these cases to end, right? But that's also the stage where misunderstandings surrounding the CGIC process can end in disaster. If evidence is, gleaned from that process, if it's going to be useful, and then coordination between CGIC and state and federal prosecutors is a must. Right? That means regularly scheduling meetings to talk about cases, to discuss the links between them, providing your prosecutors with training on NIBIN, CGIC, and E-Trace, and then working with them to mitigate the risk and impact of things like witness intimidation, because that is much more common in NIBIN-related cases. The seventh and final step is CGIC feedback to process participants. It is absolutely crucial, and I mean crucial, that every person who contributes to the CGIC process, from patrol officers who identify and collect those cartridge cases and crime guns to your evidence technicians, be provided with feedback by CGIC investigators. And I'm not just talking about following an arrest or prosecution. Preferably, that needs to happen throughout the investigative process. If you want buy-in, then you encourage it. And you do that by following up with these people. You let them know how their contributions are impacting individual cases and overall gun crime within the community. Now, as a second generation policeman, I am all too familiar with the political realities faced by law enforcement agencies, prosecutors' offices, you name it. Crime and violence go up. Some people are going to question your strategies and they're going to ask why you're not doing more with less. Crime and violence go down, and some are going to begin to question whether or not you're even necessary. We just kind of skip the part where you might have some responsibility for that decrease in crime, and we move straight to the part where you have to defend your manpower, your pay, and your existence. Uh, I get it, right? But the problem is that all too often, law enforcement agencies shoot themselves in the foot. We put ourselves in a position where we can't defend our strategies or our budget requests or even communicate how our activities have contributed to changes in crime. And in other cases, policy and practice become static. They become anecdotal rather than what they should be, which is adaptive, data informed, evidence based. And that really inhibits our ability to achieve our mission because it limits our tactical and our strategic potential. And that's why research and evidence-based strategy are so critically important. The agencies that fully embrace these perspectives, particularly when it comes to CGIC, those are the agencies that are best positioned to effect meaningful, sustained reductions in gun crime within their respective communities. And this allows me to really brag on the Chattanooga CGIC. Now that launched in 2021, July 16th. And then it was done in accordance with site recommendations offered by subject matter experts assigned by the MPI. Among them was the dissolution of the department's gang unit, which at the time was not popular, but they did it, and they merged its personnel, which included 4 investigators and 1 sergeant, with the gun team. It worked. We'll get to that part in a bit. The department also purchased and deployed a new brass tracks, new bullet trap, and mobile cameras that they could redeploy across the city in response to those spatial temporal changes in gun violence across the city. They also secured placement in the NNCTC, and then they established internal NIBIN SOPs that mirrored ATF MROs into the department's internal NIBIN procedures. Maintaining its own local database allowed the department to receive leads within 7 working days. Now, that change was particularly critical in terms of obtaining data in a timely and more robust manner. Uh, for context, I mean, prior to that implementation, the department was entirely dependent on TBI. They're a premier agency, but they're overwhelmed. And they were only able to do that in cases of the most serious forms of firearm violence. And in those cases, if a lead was developed, it typically took 10 to 16 months for CPD to receive it. Now, once a lead was produced, the gun team supervisor developed a related link chart, and that allowed them to visually represent connections between offenders. And those charts were then disseminated to all stakeholders. So that included patrol officers who'd initially responded to those calls. That approach not only reinforced the importance of accurate reporting and evidence processing, but it also eliminated information silos, and it really did a great job of increasing buy-in between units and divisions. And those efforts were supported by packaging information from the CGIC with other information from the department's Real-Time Intelligence Center and the Crime Analysis Unit. In fact, the RTIC and the CAU, they did something really cool. They developed and implemented a dashboard to track all reported gun crime across Chattanooga. And that real-time database allowed the CGIC supervisors to actively monitor gun crime. And then they could assign cases to investigators for follow-up and recanvassing. And that dashboard was also complemented by an internally maintained NIBIN lead log. So similarly, the department implemented a standardized gun form. I'm telling you now, this was a game changer. The department mandated its use by patrol in every instance in which a gun crime was seized. The form listed Miranda rights on one side and then had a list of detailed investigative questions related to ownership, possession, and time of possession on the other. And that really enhanced the ability of the investigators to establish time of possession because they would compare the information from those forms with the NIBIN lead logs. I know the unit was aware of the increased workload that would place on patrol officers. They understood. And to encourage participation and recognize, impactful efforts, the department created monthly awards that were presented to patrol officers at roll call. They made that a public showing. And a good example of that was the Top Gun Award, which was presented to the patrol officers who would recover the most chronic crime guns and remove them from circulation. The unit also committed itself to same-day e-trace of recovered crime guns and the triaging of NIBIN leads. So that allowed them to devote more resources to the identification and seizure of the most active crime guns within the community. The Hamilton County DA's office agreed to embed an assistant district attorney within the CGIC. Again, game changer. It allowed for biweekly meetings, and these were just centered on gun crime case review and discussions of how best to proceed with prosecution. The ATF also assigned 3 special agents to the unit, and then 5 CGIC investigators received ATF Task Force Office deputization so that they could expand their jurisdictional authority. The CGIC was also housed within the same facility as the crime scene unit, and that facilitated enhanced communication, and it really sped up processing time in terms of evidence from gun-related crimes. And finally, though it was not required by the grant, CPD secured research partners at UT Chattanooga who met with the unit supervisors on a biweekly basis, and then we worked together to assess the impact of CGIC implementation in practice. Now we get to the fun stuff, right? The results of everything that they did were remarkable. So in terms of process-related outcome, the average weekly number of ballistics recovered decreased by over 28%, while the average number of crime guns recovered increased by over 16%. Accordingly, average number of ballistics entered into NIBIN decreased by almost 24%, while the number of crime gun ballistic test fires entered into NIBIN increased by about 8%. The average number of crime guns linked to other crimes increased by almost 29%. Average weekly number of crime guns e-trace increased by almost 15%. And the average number of e-trace hits fell from 18 to about 7. And that was a drop of about 59%. And several desirable changes were also observed across outcomes related to impact. Right? And this is the stuff that sells. This is the stuff that you can go to your governing bodies, that you can communicate to the public. Confirmed non-fatal shootings in Chattanooga dropped by almost 35%, while 911 shots fired calls fell by over 40%. There was also a substantial decrease in caseload, with the average weekly number of cases being referred to CGIC investigators falling from 46 to about 31, so about a 31% decrease. Despite that, the average weekly number of cases cleared, that remained stable. So that means that investigators were clearing a much larger proportion of the cases that were assigned to them following implementation of CGIC. Now, arguably, the most important changes were related to case outcome. Once they implemented CGIC in Chattanooga, the average weekly number of suspects identified increased by 26%. The average weekly number arrested increased by 15%. The average weekly number prosecuted increased by almost 300%. That is not a typo. And then the weekly number increased in terms of convicted by almost 180%. And you take those things together, and these findings suggested that the introduction of CGIC corresponded with a greater number of crime guns being removed from the streets, more offenders being taken out of circulation, and decreases in gun violence across the city. And this is why research is so important. Most major cities experienced a crime drop that began in 2024. So we can and we should question whether or not any of these changes were really in response to the introduction of CGIC, or if they're just part of a broader national trend. We used a multitude of longitudinal analyses that clearly suggested that the changes I just highlighted, those began in 2021, a full 3 years before it started everywhere else, and they were directly attributable to the launch of CGIC. So as a consequence of that, the department has been able to clearly articulate its impact on gun crime to the media, to the public, and to elected officials who make decisions regarding the department's budget and leadership. Now, those are just the ways in which CGIC and research were used to impact tactical potential. However, the strategic value of CGIC and research is something that we really cannot overlook. We did some cool stuff. And that leads to innovations that give law enforcement agencies and their partners focus, on gun violence prevention. Instead of responding, we can take a more proactive response. And again, this was something the CPD fully embraced. Examples included analysis carried out by the department's research partner that enhanced understanding of how neighborhood, offender, victim, crime gun, location, and incident characteristics all come together to influence a range of outcomes. And that included things like the odds of crime gun use in multiple shootings, crime gun time in crime, the odds of offenders committing multiple gun crimes, patterns of violence escalation, odds of retaliatory gun violence, intervention windows between initial and retaliatory shootings, role transitions from victims to offenders. Um, these things they could use, internally, but one of the really awesome things that they did is they communicated a lot of this intelligence to their partners, trained violence interrupters and social workers who engage in focused deterrent strategies and get to these, chronic offenders. Many of them are kids to try to get them out of that lifestyle and present to them meaningful alternatives to the kind of lifestyle that they're engaged in. One of the other fascinating things that we started looking at was location characteristics, spatial and temporal patterns in crime, and differences between gang involved versus non-gang involved violence. One finding that sticks out in particular, about 40% of our shootings were happening at single family homes, but when we did visual inspection on those addresses, almost 100% of those single family homes had vision reducing materials on at least two sides of the structure. So we're talking about overgrown trees and shrubbery, opaque shower curtains, high privacy fences. So this allowed the city to engage in code enforcement. You don't have to arrest that problem away. These homes were being selected by offenders because they had concealment on approach. And the minute you remove that, they're taking on more risk. So by simply engaging in tree and shrubbery removal and engaging in code enforcement, you're able to reduce crime. So what we're really talking about here is the life course of crime guns and offenders. And we're talking about the factors that impact each of those things, as well as the characteristics that make certain locations more attractive for gun crime. And that provided the department with a wealth of intelligence they could use to address gun crime, again, in a much more strategic and proactive way.
Okay, so as we shift to the Detroit Crime Gun Intelligence Center, I just want to recognize the value of the progress and outcomes that have already been highlighted. Building on that foundation as it relates to the Detroit CGIC, my focus on what we can learn through research, particularly in the current landscape. Rigorous and systematic research is playing an increasingly important role in informing policy, guiding investment, and strengthening implementation moving forward. So with that in mind, I'm going to walk through a series of publishable studies that examine both the tactical and strategic potential of the Detroit CGIC. But before doing so, I want to briefly provide a background on the CGIC itself. So the city of Detroit was the recipient of the BJA FY 2018 Local Law Enforcement Crime Gun Intelligence Center Integration Initiative Award to establish a CGIC. But building a CGIC was not an overnight process. In September 2018, Detroit received the NIBIN equipment, which allowed the department to begin processing ballistic evidence in-house. Prior to that point, all NIBIN-related evidence for Detroit had to be processed by the Michigan State Police, and we were running into a lot of delays in terms of getting acquisitions into the terminals and then even getting NIBIN leads generated. Oftentimes waiting months and months and months for those NIBIN lead reports. Throughout 2019, the department built the infrastructure needed to support the center, and this included hiring a project manager and two crime analysts and developing the policies, training, and analytical processes needed to support both investigative and strategic work. And by January 2020, those core elements were largely in place, and the Detroit CGIC became operational. The Detroit CGIC was supported by the NNCTC, which is the NIBIN National Correlation and Training Center, allowing lead generation within 48 hours. And the CGIC also had access to NESS, which is short for the NIBIN Enforcement Support System, which linked the department's RMS to NIBIN and trace data. However, like many initiatives launched during this time, the center's early months were disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic, and this temporarily slowed operations and created a backlog of ballistic acquisitions that was later resolved with assistance from ATF. And then since that time, the Detroit has become, as I mentioned, fully operational and a very much embedded part of the department's approach to gun violence, which I'll dive into soon. So some processes that are worth highlighting: the Detroit CGIC maintains a biweekly meeting schedule to identify, triage, and assign NIBIN leads to detectives. And these meetings involve cross-sector partners, including ATF. We've got 9 TFOs embedded within the department, these meetings also included command staff as well. And these meetings, the purpose of them, among other things, was allow for timely follow-up and the ability to pull all levers possible. The Detroit CGIC has also provided training across precincts to strengthen understanding of NIBIN, establish NIBIN liaisons within those precincts, and promote synergy across units. The CGIC also reports successes to precinct commanders to highlight effective practices and reinforce strong investigative work. Now, to give a historical sense of the scope of evidence being collected into NIBIN, I pulled some select metrics from the NFCTA, and these are available for certain cities, so you might be able to find comparable data for your own agency. So shown here is 2017 through 2021. We're looking at the total number of NIBIN acquisitions each year. Recall that the CGIC in Detroit became fully operational in 2020, and so we're seeing a big bump up from 2019 to 2020. That's about a 99% increase in total NIBIN acquisitions. Same time frame here, we're looking at acquisitions with NIBIN leads. Again, that period of time where the CGIC's becoming operational, we're seeing an increase there, 101% increase. And now we're looking at crime guns traced to a known purchaser. We're seeing a big increase from 2019 to 2020. That's about a 93% increase there. So later, the city of Detroit was awarded CGIC extension funds through the FY24 BJA Local Law Enforcement CGIC Initiative Grant. And among other uses, the CGIC expansion funding has three critical objectives, and it's currently ongoing. The grant is set to end fall of this year. The first objective is to support the timely acquisition of ballistic evidence into NIBIN through the purchase of a second brass tracks machine. Objective 2 is to support criminal investigations by hiring a dedicated NIBIN detective. And the third and final objective is expand crime gun intelligence capabilities through the use of NIBIN data to identify patterns of gunfire, guide targeted enforcement, and prevent future shootings. While this work is ongoing, I'm going to highlight some of these efforts later on. So with that foundation set, let's turn to the tactical impacts of the Detroit Crime Gun Intelligence Center. And for that, I'll be drawing on some published research and some preliminary findings from the Detroit CGIC expansion. So foundational to NIBIN and the CGIC model is whether NIBIN leads actually help investigators move shooting cases forward. So do these leads translate into investigative outcomes, particularly for fatal and non-fatal shootings, which remain among the highest priority cases for law enforcement agencies? So my Detroit-based study takes a rigorous methodological approach to examining whether CGICs can improve clearance rates for these types of cases. And by clearance here, I mean by arrest, clearance by arrest, or exceptional means. Since the value of NIBIN lies in the ability to generate NIBIN leads, and those leads are central to the CGIC model, the study focused specifically on fatal and non-fatal shooting cases where NIBIN leads were identified. So the core question is rather straightforward, and that is, what impact did the Detroit CGIC have on clearance rates for these types of cases? So again, if the CGIC is working as intended, fatal and non-fatal shooting cases involving NIBIN leads are where we would expect to see an impact. So I won't go into the statistical weeds, but at a very high level, I use the matching approach to compare shooting cases involving NIBIN leads before and after the launch of the Detroit CGIC, and cases were matched on key characteristics so that we're making a fair apples to apples comparison. And what I found was that cases during the Detroit CGIC were nearly 5 times more likely to be cleared compared to similar cases that occurred before the CGIC was created. And these efforts were especially pronounced when the CGIC was able to fully leverage advanced intelligence capabilities, things like link analyses and hotspot analyses to support investigations. So amid a national decline in the clearance rates for violent crime, particularly for gun homicides, these gains represent a meaningful and consequential shift. As I mentioned, the Detroit CGIC received BJA expansion funding in 2024 to enhance its tactical and strategic capabilities, and central to that investment was the addition of a dedicated NIBIN detective, bringing focused investigative attention to cases that have traditionally proved the most challenging. And these cases often involve shots fired incidents identified through the city's gunshot detection system. While it is still early, so far there has been a 22% increase in NIBIN lead assignments to investigative units and a 48% increase in outcomes assessed as successful by investigators and crime analysts. The key here is that hiring a dedicated NIBIN detective has significantly enhanced the investigative process. With a NIBIN detective in place, more actionable information is identified and it's being passed along to other investigators, allowing them to dive deeper and achieve better outcomes. So let's wrap up with the strategic impacts of the Detroit Crime Gun Intelligence Center. And again, I'll dive into research that enhances a traditional firearm trafficking indicator, and then I'll highlight how NIBIN data can reveal gun patterns that law enforcement can leverage to reduce crime. So NIBIN can be used as an enhancement of a common trafficking indicator called time to crime. Time to crime measures the time between a firearm's most recent retail sale and recovery by law enforcement. A short time to crime, often one that is under 3 years, is commonly interpreted as a fast diversion into criminal use and an indicator of firearm trafficking. But recovery may occur long after the firearm was ever actually first used in crime. Time to first shooting instead measures the time from purchase to the firearm's first known shooting event, which is identified through NIBIN. When available, it provides a more accurate indicator of when a firearm first enters violent circulation. In this way, it serves as an enhancement of the traditional time to crime firearm trafficking indicator. So to illustrate this point, I examined all recovered and traced crime guns in Detroit in 2020 that generated a NIBIN lead. The median time to first shooting was 2.4 years, which is obviously below the 3-year trafficking benchmark. In contrast, the median time to crime exceeded 3 years, suggesting that firearms may be entering violent circulation earlier than time to crime alone would indicate. So stated differently, in the Detroit case, time to crime alone doesn't necessarily raise suspicion regarding firearm trafficking, at least in the aggregate. However, time to first shooting did. From a trafficking perspective, this is crucial because we're seeing how time to crime may overestimate how long it takes for firearms to enter violent circulation. NIBIN changes that. By linking incidents before a firearm is even recovered, it reveals earlier use in shooting events and potentially faster diversion into criminal networks. NIBIN can also be used to better understand how gun violence diffuses across neighborhoods. And that's because every cartridge case collected from a crime scene that is entered into NIBIN documents an incident in which a firearm was discharged. And this creates one of the most, if not the most, comprehensive database of gunfire. In Detroit, NIBIN data revealed a phenomenon known as near repeat shootings. Near repeat shootings are shooting events that occur close together in space and time. For example, within a few blocks and within a few days or weeks of one another, with the initial event triggering the second. And this idea can be expanded to longer chains of connected events across space and time. The broader research shows that once a shooting occurs, the risk of another shooting increases nearby and shortly afterward. Now, in Detroit, we found an increased likelihood of shootings within 2 blocks and within 2 weeks of an initial event. Operationally, that matters because it highlights short windows of heightened risk. After a shooting occurs, nearby areas face an elevated risk of another shooting in the days and weeks that follow. With this information, agencies can focus resources and prevention efforts where retaliation or escalation is most likely to occur. It also raises important investigative questions. Why is violence reoccurring here? And are incidents connected to the same firearm, the same individuals, the same dispute? Our research in Detroit revealed that certain environmental features may also play a role in contributing to these patterns of gunfire. We found connections to gas stations, ATMs, and liquor license retailers and parks, to name a few. So in addition to revealing these patterns, NIBIN can also be used to identify hotspots of gunfire to direct proactive enforcement activities. In the summer of 2025, the Detroit CGIC began regularly deploying gunfire hotspot maps that identified the 5 most concentrated areas of gunfire in each precinct. So during the first 6 months of deployment, more than 11% of weapons-related arrests were concentrated within gunfire hotspot maps spanning less than 8 square miles of Detroit's approximately 139 square miles of land area. So, extending this capacity beyond the duration of grant funding, the Detroit ATF Field Division is leading the development of an electronic dashboard that brings together siloed data and integrates geospatial information, allowing investigators, crime analysts, and patrol and special ops units to access close real-time information in the field. I'm going to turn it over to Rick.
I'll wrap up my part of this with a couple of points that, at least in my perspective, are critically important. First, and I really cannot emphasize this enough, is adherence to the CGIC workflow, because it really is a roadmap to success. Agencies that are serious about identifying sources of crime guns, reducing the frequency of gun crime in their communities, and building the kind of trust and confidence from their residents that fosters real communication and cooperation. Those things are much more likely to be achieved if we adhere to the CGIC workflow. The second is buy-in. All of us have seen it. The very well-intentioned plan that failed because there wasn't buy-in throughout the rank structure, especially among your line officers. And let's face it, as cops, most of us are natural skeptics. We have to be convinced. And we also need to know that our contributions are valued. And that means implementing policies that are consistent with ATF MROs, actively enforcing the practice of those policies, and then maintaining consistent communication with personnel who contribute to the CGIC throughout that entire process. If they know their contributions are having an impact, if they know those contributions are valued by the agency, and you actively demonstrate that those contributions are valued, whether that's through formal or informal recognition, I promise you, those folks are much more likely to fully buy into your vision.
So, building on that, the next question that kind of comes to mind for me at least is how do you actually turn all of this effort into impact? And just to kind of reiterate some key points that Rick mentioned. Because collecting evidence alone doesn't reduce gun violence, even generating leads doesn't necessarily reduce gun violence. Impact happens when agencies are able to consistently and quickly move from evidence to intelligence to action. In the CGIC context, that means a cartridge case doesn't just get collected, it's entered quickly with timely generation of NIBIN leads and cross-sector partners to identify actionable intelligence and follow through. The shift here is really moving beyond individual cases to identifying patterns. Are we seeing the same firearm across incidents? Are shooters clustering in time and space? Are we dealing with circulating crime guns that are driving repeat harm? That's where prevention starts, and this is where our research partner can add some value. Research partner can help structure and track NIBIN leads and outcomes, support prioritization of leads based on risk, and translate that information into patterns that are actually useful for decision making. So instead of reacting to incidents, agencies are better positioned to anticipate and intervene. And to that, I'm going to take it over to Chris for our last poll question.
Okay, folks, the last polling question is up. Which best describes your agency's experience and current interest in collaborating with a research partner, such as a university, a research center, et cetera? Your options are: we are currently collaborating with a research partner. We have collaborated in the past and would be open to future partnerships. We have not collaborated before, but would be open to doing so. We have collaborated in the past, but are not interested at this time, and we are not interested in collaborating with a research partner. We'll give everybody a few more seconds to get their votes in. I'm definitely seeing a very clear pattern here as everybody gets their votes in. I'll give you all another second or two. Okay, I think in the interest of time, let's go ahead and close down the polling and share the results. So 11% said we are currently collaborating with a research partner. 20% said we have collaborated in the past and are open to future partnerships. 43% said we have not collaborated before, but we are open to doing so. 9% said we have collaborated in the past and are not interested at this time. And 16% said we are not interested in collaborating with a research partner. Elena, what's your take on that?
Oh, I think this is great. I'm encouraged to see so many agencies that are interested in collaborating with a research partner. I really do think that it is really the best of both worlds, these types of collaborations. So this is great. Thank you. I'm going to close out that poll and just wrap up by thanking you for your time and engagement today. And again, thank you to Leads Online for providing us this opportunity to highlight our work and the value of NIBIN and the CGIC model. And both Rick and I are happy to take any questions. And you can also reach us directly through the information provided here, which I am happy to share in the chat. Thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing if that's
Actually, go ahead and keep your contact information up. That way, then people can
okay.
copy
Perfect.
down the email as if we run out of time. So, folks, thank you so much for being here. Rick, Elena, thank you so much. That was just fantastic. I loved the entire discussion and the process and the data that you shared to back everything up. So, thank you so much for doing this. We really appreciate it. And folks, if you're like me and you like this webinar, then do be sure to check out our whole lineup of webinars on our law enforcement feature page, where you'll find more of our great upcoming webinars, including our next webinar with Leads Online. Join us on May 13th when we'll be talking about value, validation, and venturing forward with virtual comparison microscopy. So if you're interested in that or any of our other related webinars, then all you need to do is go to the justiceclearinghouse.com website, go to the navigation button there in the upper right-hand corner called webinars, and then scroll through the list of upcoming webinars. So do take some time, check those out. We'd love to have you join us. Rick, Elena, we have a slew of questions if you're ready.
Ready.
Okay, kicking things off, Casey asked, why are only 12 gauge shells NIBIN eligible and not others?
Yeah, so I would suggest if you wanted to know like the in-depth reasonings behind this, I would turn you to the NFCTA Volume 2. There's a chapter in there that goes quite into depth about the reasons why certain firearms are eligible or not, but it all has to do with the cartridge cases that are spent. And so there's certain cartridge cases that can be entered into NIBIN and certain cartridge cases that can't. And certain firearms don't emit cartridge cases. So they can't be entered into NIBIN to begin with because that's a criteria. But to get into like kind of the weeds of the weeds of that, I would suggest you seek out the NFCTA, which you can do so through the ATF's website.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, next question here. Ethan asked, how has 3D printing of firearms changed the time to crime statistics?
Yeah, that and ghost guns are making life interesting for us.
Yeah, I would say though, so change the time to crime. I'm curious, we don't really have, at least in Detroit, we don't have as many PMFs as other places. I know California is like, that's like the top most contributor, I think, of PMFs. But the interesting thing about PMFs is though, they can still be NIBINed for the most
Mhm.
part if they emit cartridge cases. Most PMFs are typically the ones that I'm familiar with through the NFCTA are typically 9 millimeter. So those all can be entered into NIBIN. Well, obviously they can't be traced to a purchaser. NIBIN still works.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Beth asked, can you talk a little bit more about the internal lead logs and the dashboards? Are they integrated? Like if you see a gun crime on a dashboard, is there an indicator on the dashboard there's a NIBIN lead? Is the lead data entered manually or automatically? Do you have screenshots even that you can share?
I do have the data. I cannot screenshot it. I apologize, because I don't have permission from the PD to do that. But those are, at least for Chattanooga, those are maintained internally by the unit supervisors. So as soon as they have that information back from NIBIN, they enter that into an Excel spreadsheet. So they were manually tracking that over time.
Yeah, and there's a similar process in Detroit Police Department. They use something called Smart Sheets to share their information internally within the department.
Nice, thank you. One of our audience members asked, does NIBIN have intelligence on semi-automatic handguns chambered in revolver cartridges and calibers? For example, a 357 Magnum or a 44 Magnum.
I'm not familiar with that. My apologies. It's a very technical question. I haven't come across anything like that. Rick, have you?
I mean, I'm assuming those will still be traced very much the same way, but yeah, that one's outside my area of expertise on the technical
Yeah.
side.
Okay, thank you. Maritza asked, can you explain or talk more about trace requests?
Oh, like the general tracing process?
Correct.
Oh, okay. So when a firearm is recovered, some of this has there's some different kind of flavors of this with some enhancements that ATF has rolled out. But kind of like in a nutshell, when a firearm is recovered, there's usually typically somebody within the police department that fills out this little mini form and submits it typically electronically, sorry, to ATF. And it captures these details about a firearm, make, model, and serial number, among other things. And then with that information, ATF conducts like a little mini investigation to identify the first known, well, the most recent purchaser of that firearm. And that information is then compiled and sent back to the PD. And that can give some good investigative leads for cases. But that's kind of tracing in a super high level.
Got it. Thank you. Alec asked, are there widely accessible tools we could learn more about to get more involved with national NIBIN hits activity and crime trends?
I would suggest, if you haven't already, going to ATF's website and looking up the NFCTA. It's a 4-volume series on crime gun trafficking, crime gun intelligence in the United States. And so if you just kind of want like a very kind of introduction and then a deep dive into key areas, I would suggest going to that as a resource to kind of get the lay of the land. I don't know, Rick, do you have any other suggestions?
I mean, I'll echo that. And even the ATF website itself has some great summary-based information on CGIC and NIBIN, its scope, its breadth, how many agencies are participating, uh, what kind of evidence they're generating, and what that's translating to. There's a wealth of information just there.
Cool, thanks. One of our audience members asked, can you talk a little bit more about the correlation between victim or witness intimidation and NIBIN hits?
So, I mean, firearm-related violence, you're going to see victim intimidation a lot more. So much of it, at least in Chattanooga, is gang involved.
Mhm.
That's been one of the net benefit. And obviously, those firearm crimes become NIBIN related. And in Chad, that's one of the net benefits we've had in terms of requiring CGIC investigators to recanvass the next day. You may have had a number of reluctant witnesses the night before. They didn't want to come forward. So the department's adopted a lot of proactive strategies to increase victim cooperation. But that's something that's got to be maintained throughout that process, because we have had several documented instances of witnesses being threatened if they continue to cooperate with police. So it's
Got it.
just for
Thank
us,
you.
it's a function of gun crime itself.
Sure. Thank you. Next question. Brittany asked, I am the NIBIN technician for my agency and I work cases for several agencies at the same time. Do you have any recommendations for how to implement this with at least 40 agencies? I can recommend these things, but I don't have the ability to make it a reality.
Wow, it sounds like this might be a regional. I'm curious as to learn if this is the NIBIN technician is part of a larger regional CGIC or not. And it sounds as if I would keep out lookout for future BJA funding. Unfortunately, that window has closed, but BJA recently released some funding opportunity to establish CGIC and expansion grant. But in terms of adopting the CGIC model in your agency, how to kind of get that kind of support, oh man, that's a tough that's a tough one. I hopefully there is a growing body of evidence to suggest that the CGIC model is quite effective, and I think that's part of the reason why Rick and I are here to show that we're proving the concept here. The evidence at this point is very overwhelming as to why agencies should be adopting the CGIC model and practices. I don't know, Rick, do you have anything else to add to that?
First, I'll say I'm sorry. That is a lot. And
Yeah.
I mean, the regionals are popping up. They're becoming more and more common, but those also are going to present a very unique challenge. Cooperation between agencies, especially that many agencies, has never been a strong suit of law enforcement. And CEGIC is designed by its very nature to overcome that. I mean, that's going to have to be and preferably should have happened before everything was set up. Especially when we talk about turnover in leadership positions. I don't even want to imagine what you're going through right now. But that's going to require obviously MOUs between these agencies, and those have to be constantly reviewed and enforced. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
It sounds like there's a lot of pieces to this. It's not just a simple hire more people. It's
No,
operations, it's process improvements, it's a lot of pieces, right?
those are big
Yeah.
conversations between people that make more money than I do. But that's
Yeah.
definitely where the administrators have got to get together. But I mean, but it also has to be impressed upon them. Those are not conversations that should happen without people like you. You're there every day in the weeds with the day-to-day of it. You know what it looks like. So you need to be included in those conversations.
Yeah, and this kind of sparked something for me as well when we both Rick and I talked about the importance of comprehensive collection and kind of the between the lines there is data sharing. These agencies have to all
Mm.
have data sharing agreements amongst one another because, if you're in one jurisdiction, you're in one agency, and there's a shooting event that happens in your jurisdiction, and then, 2 cities over, a connected shooting happens. Well, that might be a black box to you if you don't have
Exactly.
collective data sharing agreement.
Mhm.
So yeah, these are some real challenges.
So Brittany texted back in while you were talking and said, "So I should basically show them this presentation, I think." And that's actually, I mean, in a
Yeah.
way, yes, the webinar is going to be important. So yes, Brittany, be watching. I know Leads Online will be sharing these links here in the coming weeks. But then, in addition to that, then Elena, Rick, are there any other business case building ideas beyond just this webinar that Brittany can use, or should she contact you offline, or what are the best strategies? Because it sounds like there's some real pain here.
I mean, I'm happy to help, and I know Elena is as well. And I'm actually having this, Brittany, I'm having the same conversation now with a good friend and colleague. He's also former law enforcement. We went through grad school together. Um, he's talked to several agencies where he's at now that are in the early talks of a regional. My strong recommendation for them, because we've actually had some success with it in Tennessee, is to house that CGIC at the university. That way, even if we have changes in
Oh,
leadership or we end up with those famous disagreements between law enforcement agencies, uh, the operational effectiveness of that CGIC is not compromised by those things because of where it's housed.
the university
Um,
becomes a neutral
you're
ground.
absolutely right. So one example, and I can off the top of my head, is East Tennessee State University has an on-site NIBIN. And Wichita State, I believe they have
Yes,
a Center for Crime and
yes.
Intelligence.
Yeah.
Um,
Hopefully, Brittany, hopefully we're giving you some good advice here, and happy to if you've reached out to either one of us, we're happy to support.
Well, and frankly, for all of the agencies out there who are even thinking about this process. So, kind of piggybacking on that notion, as agencies expand or even explore NIBIN and CGIC strategies, et cetera, are we thinking enough about the human infrastructure behind this? What's the ideal staffing model? Do we have even enough people going into these professions to be able to support the kinds of crime gun intelligence research that needs to be done? I mean, where are we at in terms of the human factor in all of this?
I mean, I think it requires some rethinking of how we do business. I mean, thankfully, again, the departments that do that well, they embrace it. And then again, I think I mentioned during my presentation, they dissolved the gang unit and they merged every person or every investigator involved in that unit with the gun team. So they're now part of CGIC. That initially, as you can imagine, was not a popular decision. It was the right one. And it didn't take long to see the results from it. And at that point, everybody embraced it. And it's where I think too, having partnerships with higher ed, with researchers can be beneficial. We're working right now at UTC on getting familiarity is an issue. It's always going to be. So we're trying to develop, it won't be a live CGIC site. What we're working on is a crime gun intelligence training center. We'll have all of the brand new equipment
Yes.
from Leads Online, but that allows us to get all of our, future practitioners, our future police officers and prosecutors, classroom exposure and hands-on experience with this equipment. They can understand it. They can speak CGIC, for lack of a better way of phrasing it, before they ever go into the field. And I think that's just one way that we can further encourage familiarity
Train the
with
next
NIBIN and
generation.
CGIC and get them trained into it early.
Yeah, and to add to that, in terms of personnel, it really depends on the volume of gun violence in your jurisdiction. That could be, very different, and that would affect the number of folks you need to establish a CGIC. I will say that, triage, like you need dedicated people to do these tasks. It would be very difficult, I think, to split responsibilities with people who have, other jobs within an agency. One kind of cool thing that Leads Online has is something called ClearCase, and that would really help with the triage process of which is like preceding the step of acquiring a cartridge case into the brass tracks machine. And that I think could also help in terms of saving on staff. And firearm examiner, as I mentioned, if you want to be able to present that NIBIN lead in court, you has to become a NIBIN hit, which requires examination by a certified firearm examiner. So that's an additional cost. And unfortunately, I don't quite know the popularity of those fields nowadays, but that's certainly something that agency has to consider if they want to start a CGIC.
Oh my gosh. Well, we'll have to leave it there. That was just a fantastic conversation. Thank you, thank you, thank you for being here. This was a fascinating presentation today. I really appreciate it. It looks like the audience really were engaged with the topic as well. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank
And
you for
folks,
having us.
absolutely. Oh, and here comes the emojis. Oh, thank you. And folks, be sure to join us right back here tomorrow, as a matter of fact, for another one of our double headers. During our 1 p.m. Eastern webinar, we'll be talking about gender-based violence on college campuses. And then during our 3 p.m. Eastern webinar, we'll be talking about managing mental health and mental illness in jails. So do be sure to join us or have somebody from your organization or agency join us if you can. And with that, this concludes today's Justice Clearinghouse webinar. Have a super rest of your day, everybody. We'll see you right back here tomorrow. Bye now.
Bye.